So we've been immersed in the world of rhetoric, rhetorical strategies, ways that we can make our language much more understandable and more emotionally effective and logical. And so we're going to look more at the practical side of things as we are moving into our last week and a half-ish of instruction. Again, your podcast is due closer to finals week, but that means that next week we're really pulling everything together. So I want to talk today about the other element, other than just being persuasive and showing people that this is a problem, that this is something that's related to bias and can have these negative effects on society. We also want to start looking towards what it is that you are wanting people to take away from this, because there is an element of a call to action that we're going to talk about a little bit more on Monday. That'll really be the first or the last full lesson. And also how we address those blind spots that might exist within our own topic, how we shut down the naysayers, because this isn't a debate. There's no Q&A afterwards. And so that means that we have to be in charge of commanding our own narrative. And we are not going to look very authoritative if we're not considering these other sides, considering these obstacles. But there's a trick to it because we don't want to completely indulge it. So first, I want us to identify what are some of the obstacles here that might keep me from delivering a call to action that's really effective, or even getting people to care about this. And then, how do I form this into a counter argument? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so everything that we're studying, I think I used this term at the beginning of the semester, is a wicked problem. And that isn't just a problem that somebody from Boston has. I think that's a very good joke that I just made. But it's a sociological term that was created by these design theorists in 1973. And it's a real thing. It has a real Wikipedia page. And it's just a problem that's difficult or impossible to solve for a number of reasons. The mainly that, I'll just summarize these reasons of theirs. Problems can bleed into one another, that as soon as you propose some kind of solution, another thing pops up, kind of like a hydra in Greek mythology. You cut off one head and another head grows back. So the solutions could have more problems. Those problems are really interconnected, and it's just impossible to even sort of put a stopper on it. And then means that we need to move towards improving rather than solving. So if we think back to that video we watched at the very beginning of the semester with John Oliver, that I said this is kind of what we're aiming towards, something that is colloquial enough. We can reach out to our audience with a matter of respect, obviously not humor, but we're going through collecting these sources, presenting a problem, and then hopefully maybe not a solution, but bringing up some practical ways that we think the common person or those who are leaders could start to fix some of the problems. And so the main problems with these problems is that a lot of times they are very unstructured. They're also cross-cutting and relentless. So I'm going to define each of those, and you can be thinking about your topic and where yours fits in as I go through. So the idea that wicked problems are unstructured, it's really difficult to figure out the causes and effects. So people have a problem identifying, how did this really begin? And so you guys have spent some time trying to find causes, but let's take something like homelessness. There's a lot of different causes, and there's not a singular thing that we can attack. Affordable housing and employment is part of it. I think about Noah's speech, looking specifically at San Francisco. That even is its own unique microcosm. Homelessness in San Francisco has different causes than homelessness in LA. There is a lot of carryover, but it's not all the same. Is there a connection between affordable housing and employment? Can we even lump those together? To what level do personal circumstances enter into it, or just community circumstances based off of, race or sexual orientation or religion or anything like that, or just, living the area code that you're in? So unstructured. So cross-cutting means that there's these overlapping stakeholders. So different people want different things. And I use homelessness because it's just, I think, the best overall example. Nobody can agree on what to do about homelessness. And we've seen this in LA with everybody fighting over who has to have the shelter built in their city. For a while, Mid-Wilshire was just completely picketing, putting up a shelter in Mid-Wilshire because it was nearer to schools, especially where I live in Orange County. Every city is just fighting about like, well, we shouldn't have it for all these reasons. But there's a lot of different stakeholders here. So local shelter operators are probably going to have a different opinion about what we should do than local government or social service, medical professionals, those who've actually been homeless, local business owners, who, from my friends who own local businesses, are very conflicted. They may, believe we should provide for housing or not criminalize homelessness. At the same time, many of my friends have had people drawn away from their businesses because of issues with homelessness and loitering. So it gets very, very tricky to make everybody happy, and we just can't. And lastly, relentless. They just can't be solved once and for all. If we just built a shelter or more shelters, that wouldn't do it. If we just built affordable housing, obviously because there's lots of different causes, there isn't a singular solution. And we can bring things together like, oh, what if we also do health screenings? But it's still not going to solve that thing, which is really what makes people hesitant to go into any kind of social justice advocacy, is there's not that satisfaction of, look, we did it. We got something done. And so there's a couple areas. And again, as I go through here, think about your topic. Where does your topic fall on this? So many of your topics are just really complex. And so your audience for the podcast may have just no firsthand experience with it. Something like foreign policy. I don't think any of us have had direct experience in foreign policy. So those of you who are dealing with something on a global level, that's going to be really hard to get your audience to even engage in, let alone agree to a certain resolution. It could also be just too difficult to understand, especially for those of you dealing with legal or government systems. So I think about Grace a little bit with this one, which you're kind of on it because you have experience with the legal system, but your audience may not. And so trying to get your audience to understand a system first before you can even propose anything, it's exhausting mentally. It may be just too unwieldy, so new problems will replace solved problems. So anything related to civil rights and race falls into this of, sure, you can solve that little thing, but overall, this is so large, and racism is not illegal, and it doesn't just end. It's prevalent in all cultures and internally. Or too multifaceted. So I had a lot of students a couple of years ago trying to do the Syrian refugee crisis in the EU, and it's like, holy shit, there's just so much there. It's so difficult to even like narrow in on what aspect of this do I need to solve. So you can sort of throw out most of your topic and just choose a very small area. You may just say like, yes, these things are going to be difficult to fix, but let's focus in on this one component, and maybe we can just just alleviate some of these symptoms. So cutting it down is helpful. This won't apply to everybody, but cultural history plays a really big role in how your topic is accepted and if that person does feel, inclined to react to your call to action. So there are some topics that just have conditioned responses, things having to do with gender, abortion's another one of these, death penalty. Anything that we've been taught is a partisan issue, and I use partisan lightly, of there are two sides and you have to fall to one. So we know that that's an either or fallacy. That isn't true. There's always more than one option. However, we live in a society that presents things to us that way. And so if you have a topic that does fall into people saying yes or no, good or bad, you're going to want to navigate that carefully of how to show that perhaps there are other options, or use some of that softening language that we talked about in our last lesson to not make people react immediately to that. So there also are those like that bring up taboos like prostitution, mental illness. Anytime that you talk about rights for sex workers, people just don't really want to listen, even if they hear your argument. They're like, yeah, that logically makes sense. We live in a society that criminalizes sex workers because we have a lot of issues with sexual expression in our society. And so it's hard to get people on board because it's this thing that's taboo and they shouldn't talk about it. And lastly, conflicts with outside religious or cultural traditions. I'm trying to think if anybody has some of these. I don't know. Mirai maybe with Japanese culture, but again, you're dealing with something more gender-based. I don't know. Being sensitive to the culture. We don't want to run there and say, like, what they're doing is wrong. And honor killings is a great example of this. Honor killings occur in small communities, most of them very fundamentalist or extremist Muslim, but that's not it. Also happens in Christian enclaves. But if it's better to, kill, let's say, your daughter that shamed you by being seen kissing a boy or something, than it is to let her live. And so it's something that is accepted in certain small communities. And so we would say that thing is wrong. But there's a rhetorical fallacy in there too. We can't say that something is wrong because we live in a culturally relativistic society. And so be sensitive when dealing with another culture. We can't just run in there like for many of us Americans we were raised to be and say this is how this thing should change. There needs to be sensitivity. Second to last one, cost, and that is cost broadly. When you're thinking of fixing a problem, money always comes into it. So a lot of people have used topics that are related in some way to healthy eating. Food deserts. We live very near to a food desert of West Adams. It's now becoming slowly gentrified, but there are in greater West Adams, there's very few grocery stores that carry fresh foods. Also, the population is predominantly lower class, working class, lower class, and who need to take buses for transportation. And many are non-normative workers, so not working 9-to-5 jobs. And so when you're thinking of everybody should eat healthy, we need to close down, for example, fast food restaurants. Well, there's a lot of people who rely on fast food restaurants to feed their families for a really low amount of money. And you could go buy a $6 bagged salad, that's even actually pretty cheap, from Whole Foods or a grocery store, and that wouldn't feed a whole family for the same amount that you could buy off dollar menus. So and also, corporations are not going to be too happy about you closing down all of those grocery stores. So it ends up being a big financial issue for those who are afflicted and also the companies who profit off of that. Time is another cost. This is where conservation efforts come in, coupled with we can't see any results. But yes, beach cleanups take time to do, and then it's going to be dirty again in a week and a half. And so it's very hard to convince people to give up their time because time is money and time is valuable. And lastly, power, prestige, and reputation. So I use the example of birth control coverage for this. This is something I deal with one of the schools that I teach at, Biola, which I just realized that you guys had asked me a question about that one sample outline about the gay students and LGBTQ students not being allowed into Biola. And I was going to talk about that. And obviously we're not in class anymore. So if anybody's interested, I'll try to pull together some stuff on that, or I'll record a video, and it will be optional. And if you are interested in that, it's a very fascinating. So this is another area that I fight with a lot internally. They are technically not mandated to provide birth control, and I think they do now, but they won't provide any Plan B pills in their health insurance plans for faculty because it goes against their faith. And so a lot of what happens for universities or businesses like Hobby Lobby is that they will lose some of their reputation if they end up covering something like birth control or emergency abortion drugs. So they are losing something that isn't necessarily money. It's more of that sense of power. And lastly, control. Kind of referenced this before a little bit, but people can't see how they can help something like global warming or gendercide, female babies being killed in areas of rural areas of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, places like that. We can't help no matter what we do. If we recycle, it's not going to make it better. So that's where a lot of armchair activism comes in of, well, yeah, that's right. That's really bad that thing is happening, but what can I do? And so it's our job as rhetoricians to give them something that's manageable that they can do, or at least get them thinking about it, the proverbial mustard seed that'll be planted in their brains, and maybe they will read up more about it. If there's an ideological shift, so something like, I don't know, those of you who are looking at racial issues within Hollywood, that relies on way more than executives just assigning roles to people of color. It relies on a completely different way in which we envision, for example, the leading man, the leading lady, or certain roles that are stereotypically assigned to certain actors of color or to white actors. So it takes, the cost is bigger than that, and it takes some time, or a lack of empathy. If there's been somebody who is dehumanized, which you talked a little bit about dehumanizing language in the last lesson. So think about where some of your obstacles lie, because that's a good place for you to start addressing counter argument. So I thought about mine. If you remember, I was talking about women with ADHD. And my last speech was going through like how systemically women just were not tested, and the diagnosis criteria was established for just boys. So then when girls like myself in the 90s were screened, obviously it wouldn't come up with ADHD. And so while boys were receiving the help that they needed, whether through cognitive therapies or through medication, or even just awareness from teachers, girls didn't, because our symptoms were different, such as more inattentiveness and much more withdrawn and quiet. But then that sort of breeds a lot of mental illness and self-hatred, because you just sort of like, why can't I do this thing is what comes up, but it's very private. And so I was trying to come up with some obstacles. And I think one of mine, if I was addressing this, is that people have a fixed view of ADHD, whether it's the hyperactive boy or whether it's, they just associate it with drugs for, study purposes. Same with fixed view of medication, that Adderall is the study drug. And it definitely gets a bad rep for that, for people misusing it. So I have to address people's initial attitudes towards it and help them figure out that there is a human toll to this. This isn't just looking at medical stuff. There's also just a lack of understanding about it, period. It's really hard to explain to somebody who doesn't have it. Same with those of you who experience depression or bipolar or anxiety, or OCD. It's really hard to explain that kind of stuff to somebody who understandably doesn't feel what you feel. Social costs. So there is judgment for a lot of women if they speak up about it. This is actually at Loyola. I lost a promotion because I or not a promotion. It was like an extra little side thing because I brought it up in an interview, and it was explained to me later that they just didn't think that I would be able to do a certain kind of task. And it was like 2013 or something. And it's fine. But there is social cost now for if people say like, oh yes, I have this thing. If we associate ADHD with being severely unorganized, we're going to assume that that's, how they're going to behave in that role. And lastly, there's the gender roles of this idea that women should have it all now, the phrase having it all, being able to hold down a job and be in charge of their family and have kids. And that is incredibly stressful for women with ADHD, but there is this expectation of women balancing stuff at home. Even though we live in a growingly egalitarian society, women still carry 70% of the household tasks in a two-partner household where both work full-time. So that's just really ingrained in our history. We view women as domestic even when they're working more or at the same as men. So I need to take these and construct some sort of a counter argument. And that's just this awareness of like, yes, I know these things exist. I need to clear them up for you. I need to make sure that I have something to say back to someone when they are talking about Adderall being overprescribed, which I hear a lot. And, if people would just, rely on meditation and things like that, then they would fix their ADHD. I need to have an argument for that, because I'm going to get those arguments, whether or not it shows up in the comments on YouTube or whatever. So there's two things you can do with your counter argument. One you can turn against, and one you can turn back. And I think we're used to the turn against, but turning back is actually really useful. So when you turn against, this is where an audience completely disagrees. So you're just saying like, no, that your argument's dumb. Or you could just say, that's not even important. Just like, shut up, it's not important, except don't say shut up. So that's the typical counter argument when you're saying, oh, some people say this, but they're wrong. So if there's major opposition, that's a good place to do it. If if there's certain evidence that's played down, if there's practical drawbacks, if you just realize that your solution won't work, that's where these will come up. And again, we're going to talk about solution on Monday. So how we do that, we introduce the fact that you're challenging briefly. The big mistake that people make with counter arguments is just giving it too much space. And in writing, it'll be like a whole counter argument paragraph, and then you just leave it there. And that's just like giving a platform for someone else's argument in your own argument. So you state the case against you again very briefly, and then you could do one of these three things. You could refute it, you could acknowledge it, or you could concede. Hopefully no one is completely conceding, but you can bring up an alternative that makes more sense. You could what was that? I don't even remember what that was. Why did I even read that? Anyways, forget that slide. So when you introduce, there's a lot of great ways you could do that. These are some that I turn to, except I don't really do the one. It might seem that it's true that admittedly, but I go back on myself a lot and say like, but how do we promote, diagnosis in an era where, people talk about over medication all the time? So I don't even have to say who the naysayers are. I can just sort of word it into my own rhetorical questioning almost. When you state the case, briefly, forcefully, point to evidence if it's possible. If your counterargument seems evasive, it's going to do more harm than good because people aren't going to trust you. And when you turn back, you can use like a but, yet, however, nevertheless, still. And then as you reason, you can refute it. So you show why it's completely mistaken. It's not a real problem. You could acknowledge it, say like, yeah, that's a great point. There is a lot of over prescribing. That's a huge problem. However, what we're talking about, are people who actually have this disorder who need that medication, not those who are using the system. So you're still giving it space and saying, yes, it's important. Or you could just completely concede it. I probably wouldn't recommend conceding it. So where does it go? You could place it in your introduction. If there's a really main counter argument that's kind of clouding all of your argument, you could just literally make it part of your thesis, saying like, people think this, however, here's why this is a problem. That's completely fine. It works just after the introduction to kind of get yourself going, to get it out of the way, showing like, yeah, I understand people are going to react this way. However, I like to do quick moves within a main point. I call it like putting out fires where they spring up. And so then you're not drawing too much attention to like, this is the counter argument place. It's just if something small arises, you quickly deal with it. You fold it over after you make your argument, and then you're done. A lot of people do it just before the conclusion. I don't like that one personally. I think it sounds kind of like high school papery. So tips for a counter argument: don't overdo it. It shouldn't be a major focus or its own point. Definitely figure out what your obstacles are first. And just, again, do not give too much space to naysayers. We cannot do it. It will make you look pretty bad. What was I doing with that? Not much. We'll look at that later. So what we're going to be doing for our quote-unquote class today is just giving some space for people to attack your topic. And so we're all going to be playing devil's advocate a little bit, not meanly, but trying to point out, okay, where may there be some holes in this? So I'll already also post this in the discussion board, but you'll just briefly summarize, here's where I'm at, here's why I think this is a problem. If you have some ideas for alleviating, for solving, definitely throw those out there, and you are going to respond to everyone's this time, and give a couple comments of what you think people may say or how they could attack it. And that's it.